one of my childhood memories is my mom telling me that I should never repeat to anyone at school, what we talk about at home because,
Right.
otherwise daddy could go to jail. For some reason, it was always daddy, not mommy, but because I guess he was a little more kind of outspoken. But yeah,
Right.
but so yeah, I had the experience of that system, and I had the experience of, let's say, my family listening to clandestine radio broadcasts
Mm.
from Radio Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free
Radio Free
Europe,
Europe.
and the
Yeah.
Voice of America. So, I had that experience of exposure to, forbidden materials, so to speak.
Yeah,
And
I'm sorry to cut you off, but I always find it fascinating when we have a guest on that has had firsthand experience uh, in a lot of in the different ideologies that we find competing, and for a lot of folks in America, especially people who were born here and whose parents perhaps have been here for a couple of generations, that they kind of lose touch of the American ideal in a way that uh, immigrants, children of immigrants, e- e- experience it and understand what we consider take for granted here. And I love hearing those stories. I find it very similar to my own. I was born here, but I'm a first generation American. My father
oh,
came here. He left just as the communists were taking over parts of Greece and
oh
the
yeah,
island that
yeah,
he was from. So he was able
yeah.
to get out, and I always tell people, you have some Americans here who give lip service to being anti-communist, but I can remember my father sitting me on his knee when I was like 4 or 5 years old, and he said, "Now remember, we don't like communists." And when in my own infantile way, I would say, "Why is that, Dad?" He would say, "Because back on the island, they were the only ones who were allowed to have guns."
Ah,
And,
that's
and it,
interesting.
it-
Wow,
right, and that
that is
hits you in a
fascinating.
right that hits you in a way that you don't typically experience here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And I
So that's
wanted
kinda like the First and the Second Amendment all kinda rolled
all
up into
rolled
one,
up into
right?
one, right? Yeah. So I wanted to
Yeah,
ask you, particularly because I did read in your bio, you did come over in 1980. You were a teenager essentially at the time, as you
yeah.
mentioned, 17. And from my own experience in the late 80s, and I think it may tie into your experience, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. So, from your perspective, also being a Russian Jew, did you leave because of religious persecution, political ideology, some combination? How did your family? I assume your whole family came over. Correct me if
Yeah,
I'm wrong.
yeah, it was at the time, it was my, parents and my grandmother. I mean, religious persecution per se, I mean, my family was never religious, so, that was not an issue for us, although, there was still, just the knowledge
Mm,
that certain things are essentially forbidden. And, at the time, it wasn't just for Jews, any manifestation of religious belief,
right,
kind of marked you as suspect. My mother had an experience because my mother was a piano teacher who worked in one of Russia's kind of more prestigious professional music schools. And, she taught students one on one, so she kind of had a personal relationship with a lot of them.
mm,
And at one point, she got a call from the mother of one of her students who said, "Oh my God, you've got to help me because we have a serious problem. Natasha has become religious and she's wearing a
oh,
cross. And I'm just really worried that if somebody finds out about this, she's not going to get into any college. You really need to talk to her about it and,
wow,
tell her to be at least discreet about it." And my mom kind of felt really bad because on the one hand, on what grounds would she tell this,
right,
17-year-old girl to, not espouse or, be discreet about her religious beliefs. But on the other hand, the mom had real concerns because at the time it really was the situation where, one thing that I can tell you was that on Easter, they would actually send, the authorities would actually send, sort of young Communist League activists to
Mm.
stand outside churches and take the names of, any fellow student that they saw who might be going in. So
Wow.
they were spying on people. They would also, because a lot of people in the Russian tradition, in the Russian Orthodox tradition, there is a tradition of going to on Easter, going to your loved ones' graves, and the people bring sort of well, I don't know if gifts is the appropriate word, but like there's a certain type of Easter food that you like put down
Right.
on the
I got you.
grave of the person. You probably know this, right? Because you're from
Yeah, my family's Greek Orthodox, so I'm sure there's a
yeah,
relationship there.
there's I'm
Yeah.
sure there's a related thing. Anyway, so yeah, so they would also send these young activists to stand at the gate of cemeteries again, watching for anyone they knew from school who might be going to the cemetery to do the sort of Easter rite. So
Wow.
yeah, and in terms of Jewish religious practice, in a way, it was a little more restrictive because there was only one synagogue in all of Moscow, and there was definitely a sense that if you went to the synagogue, you were kind of unnoticed. So
Yeah.
yeah, so there was that. I think mainly, my family was interested in emigrating, because of political repression, because,
Mm.
it really was a country where, you couldn't openly criticize the government. There were certain books that you could read only in secret. My father brought home, these underground editions of Solzhenitsyn,
Mm.
that were kind of passing from hand to hand, so he would only get to keep it for a week and then, had to give it back. There were other books by the emigre writers that, again, were some of them were kind of self-published in TypeScript. Some of them were published abroad and were kind of secretly
It
circulated. And it was
like an
dangerous stuff. Like
like an underground library,
yeah,
basically.
basically.
Yeah.
And, and again, like, you knew that you could get in serious trouble for this.